Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Glass Academy Webinars 2026, presented in association with Ethos Empowers. This year's overarching theme, Envisioning India at 2047, Building the Next Century of Progress, invites us to reflect on how architecture, infrastructure, materials, technology, and human experience collectively shape the future of our cities and communities. As cities grow and urban systems become more complex, public infrastructure is no longer defined by just function, capacity, or efficiency. Increasingly, it is expected to actively support well being, inclusivity, environmental comfort, learning, healing, and everyday social interaction. From schools and healthcare facilities to transit hubs, libraries, and community spaces, these environments shape how people experience the city, how they learn, recover, move, and connect with one another. This shift has transformed how we define infrastructure, no longer viewed solely as physical systems, but increasingly understood as human centered environments that shape emotional experience, accessibility, climate responsiveness, public interaction, and collective well being. Today's session, titled Glass in Public Infrastructure Designing for Health, Learning, and Community, explores these ideas through the lens of design, urban systems, and material experience. Traditionally seen as a facade or enclosure material, glass today plays a far more active role in public environments. It influences daylight, visibility, spatial perception, and psychological comfort, while also contributing to environmental performance and human interaction within shared spaces. In addition to materiality, this conversation is about how public infrastructure can be designed to be more humane, inclusive, and responsive to the people it serves. To guide us through this discussion, we are delighted to welcome architect Nupur Khanter, an urban designer, researcher, and architect whose work focuses on interdisciplinary human-centered approaches to cities. With extensive experience across India and global contexts, including projects in the USA, Peru, Kenya, and Sri Lanka, her work spans urban planning and design at multiple scales, from neighborhood level interventions to citywide strategies for climate adaptation, public infrastructure, and urban resilience. She brings together design, policy, and community engagement to help create cities that are more inclusive, resilient, and livable. Architect Nupur is currently a research fellow at Transitions Research. Her work and commentaries have been featured in Monga Bay India, India Development Review, and Hindustan Times. She is also a climate based fellow and has spoken at international forums, including the Community Based Adaptation Conference 2026. We are truly delighted to have you with us today, Architect Nupur.
Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca. I'm happy to be here.
So let's get started. So you work at the intersection of urban systems, climate action, and social transformation. So when you look at cities today, what major changes do you think are reshaping public life and infrastructure?
I think one of the biggest shifts I'm seeing is a growing consensus that infrastructure and public spaces cannot be understood as a purely technical problem. We're seeing with climate change and resource constraints and social inequalities that are forcing us to ask different questions about the built environment. And rather than applying templatized or generic solutions, there is a need to understand the specific ecological, cultural, or social systems that shape each place. For me, I think this also corresponds to how we can be more responsive to the everyday lives of people. And that also means expanding what we consider relevant knowledge for us to reshape public life and infrastructure. So we can no longer rely on just architecture or engineering or so on. We need to learn from different disciplines like ecology, economics, public health, anthropology, performance, and other forms of practice because they reveal how people experience and make meaning in cities and public spaces.
So, ma'am, it's never just the act of one field, right? It's all coming together for the well-being of the people. So, urbanists often talk about working across scales, from the city to the street to the lived human experience. So, why is this layered way of thinking important when we talk about designing public infrastructure today?
Yeah, I think that's a really critical question. And that's something I've also spent my career working on, is to ensure a project always operates at several scales. And to me, this working across scales is really about understanding relationships. For instance, a neighborhood park or a canal or a public building or a market, it's never an isolated object, right? It sits within these larger systems and fosters a particular type of social life. So if we focus only on one scale, we risk solving one problem while creating another at a different scale. And this is particularly important when working with water and watershed boundaries as well. I also think there's an advantage because when you look across scales, you'll identify certain connections, dependencies, and that will allow you to conceptualize opportunities for synergy, right? Like how things can help each other that can be invisible when you use a conventional planning approach. So, this sort of cross scale thinking will help you see where we can leverage opportunities in a public space.
True, true, very true, Architect Nupur, what you said. So, when you are approaching a public infrastructure project, so what would be the key layers that you would consciously study, like social behavior, climate, or spatial patterns? And how do these layers begin to shape your early design thinking?
Yeah, I this brings me back to architecture school, right? Where one of the first exercises you did was something called a site analysis. And over time, I have actually changed my stance on that, where I prefer the term site construction over site analysis. Traditional design approaches, you begin with a predefined site boundary, right? But urban challenges rarely operate within these limits and rarely physical at all. So to me, in terms of like even when you're thinking about a design project or approaching anything in the public realm, the first task is therefore to construct the site yourself by identifying the connections, flows, and relationships that shape it. And these can be connections of like infrastructure, it can be people, information, it can be money. You have to understand these networks and forms of agency that influence these networks, right? And some of these can be obvious, for example, government institutions or like a formal planning process or so on. Some are more subtle. For example, like are there some everyday practices that people here do in this area? Are there cultural traditions? Is this space used in informal ways? Are there community groups that have a claim on these spaces? Or are there ecological processes that affect this project? And I am particularly interested in what is not immediately obvious. What might be unique and quirky? For example, are there sort of seasonal rhythms to this space? How do people use and experience this normally? Are there histories that are embedded in this landscape and so on? So, for me, the goal is really to understand how different actors and systems come together to produce and construct a place. And that again will tie into a layered way of thinking where it will reveal tensions and opportunities that would remain invisible in a conventional site analysis. So these layers and sort of understanding constructing a site will help move the conversation beyond infrastructure as an object or a project. And you start thinking of infrastructure as part of a living system. So for me, like any urban design or public project, it cannot begin with a bounded site, right? It has to begin with a carefully constructed understanding of the relationships on that site.
True, true. That interdisciplinary way of thinking is so important when it comes, especially in the early stages of the design. So now we're gonna just focus down to any healthcare infrastructure. So uh, infrastructure like hospitals, clinics. The experience is deeply tied to emotional well-being, stress, and healing. So, how do environmental strategies and material choices like glass solutions contribute to creating a calmer and more supportive healing environment?
Yeah, absolutely. The design of healthcare spaces, and in general, I think even public spaces, it has a significant impact on comfort and recovery. For example, if your public spaces are not welcoming, then people are not going to be walking so much, and then will naturally lead to poor health outcomes. So, in that sense, even your choice of materiality, and in India, we have a huge tradition of we've learned how to build with our climate, and then a material like glass, which allows you access to daylight. It allows a sort of visual connection to nature. It also allows for thermal comfort, and it helps you kind of control your indoor air quality and so on. These can all influence how people experience a space. And especially, I'm increasingly seeing examples where glass has played a really important role when used thoughtfully. For example, we don't want a glass facade that has no response to India's climate, but if we can use it in combination with other local materials, it helps bring in natural light, it helps bring in visual openness, a sense of indoor outdoor, and it helps you really balance privacy and thermal performance of a space. So I think in that area, glass can be used thoughtfully and really play a critical role in the light in a space.
And when we speak about educational environments such as schools and learning spaces, design directly influences attention, behavior, and engagement. So, how do you see the role of glass shaping learning environments?
Yeah, learning environments definitely benefit when students feel connected to their surroundings and have access to good quality daylight, right? So, this is daylight that's screened or so on. And glass helps you create sort of a visual continuity throughout a space. It also improves legibility of the space. You're able to see beyond and identify things. And in learning spaces, particularly, I think it helps create a sense of openness because of its porosity. So the goal is not really transparency for its own sake, right? Not just glass for glass's sake, but we can see how creating environments with glass can support concentration, curiosity, and interaction. And so revealing some, not revealing little, encouraging certain students to figure out their own pathway to a space. All of these can shape fun and curious children in learning environments.
Yeah. And on a little larger scale, so when you're designing community infrastructure such as library, civic centers, or neighborhood hubs, so what becomes most important in creating spaces that feel inclusive, accessible, and comfortable for diverse users?
I think for me, the most important question is whether people see themselves reflected in that space. A community infrastructure has to accommodate different ages, abilities, and ways of using space. But the way to design these projects or proposals need to have participatory processes. And the idea there is to uncover local knowledge. Are there certain aspirations that these people hold and so on that we can reflect in our space? And these sort of insights will often lead to more relevant and resilient outcomes because communities become partners in shaping and caring for the space as opposed to end users. And I think that sort of stewardship is also something that I built my career on is how can we do more inclusive community engagement so spaces feel relevant and cared for by people themselves.
Yeah, and how do you think participatory or community-led inputs inform your design decisions in such projects?
Yeah, absolutely critical because to me, of course, I have the lens of a designer and an expert who's an outsider, right? So when you're going into a particular space or community, it's very important and I think useful to get how the community thinks of themselves or what they desire. And that can help then guide design directions and decisions of like what are the priorities for this community? What are they lacking? Or how do they even imagine themselves? And to create so this again, I think blends into what I said earlier about this would enable you to construct a site, right? So you're not just going off of criteria like temperature, wind speed, and so on, but like stories of how does this place exist and who makes it and who unmakes it, and those sort of inputs really help guide which direction your design should go in.
Definitely. And you've spoken so much about how public infrastructure is not just as a functional necessity, but as an environment that shapes well-being, community, and everyday public experience. So, could you maybe walk us through a few of your projects or case studies and show us how ideas around climate responsiveness, public comfort, and openness, and materials like glass have been integrated within them?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to share. I think as designers, we often tend to focus on what we build, but equally important is our ability to read what already exists. And one idea that has deeply influenced my thinking comes from landscape architect Anne Winston Spern, who directed the West Philadelphia Landscape Project. And she speaks about this concept of landscape literacy, of how landscapes tell stories of how and why they came to be. And it's this ability to read them and the stories they tell that will inform future work. And a big part of this has been in this project in West Philadelphia called Milk Creek, where they taught about hundreds of children to read the neighborhood's landscape. And so this had to do with like what the history of the place was, what are physical traits we see today, and what the history of the community has been. And this landscape literacy enabled residents of the neighborhood to read the environmental, social, economic, and political stories embedded in their local landscape. But more importantly, it gave them a way to formulate new stories, to envision how they could transform their neighborhood. And this leads to where I have taken the concept of water, of landscape literacy, is for me, water in cities is one of the clearest examples of this. And what happens in when we erase water from everyday life, and as we're seeing now in the country, even more urbanization is continuing to threaten ecology and so on. But water as an entity has shown it finds its way back spatially and often destructively, reappearing where it was once eradicated. I grew up in Chennai, a city that experiences both severe flooding and water scarcity. At first glance, these may seem like opposite problems, but they emerge from the same story. Historically, Chennai functioned as a landscape of interconnected tanks and seasonal water systems that expanded during the monsoon and contracted during dry months. So, in a sense, they were designed to work with the rhythms of water in the monsoon. However, we see a history of filling and building over these lakes, tragically, quite tragic, in the city of Chennai. This map that I have on the screen, which shows Chennai in 1909, and you can clearly see the extent of the long tank, a major water body that once defined the western edge of the city. Comparing the historical and present day maps, it reveals how dramatically the landscape has changed. Right? Over time, many of these water bodies have been filled, built over, and disconnected from one another. Water increasingly became something to control, channel away, and keep out of sight. And one example that I wanted to dwell on is the Long Tank, which was a large lake that once was a part of Chennai's hydrological system. Today, much of it has disappeared. And the Mambalam Canal that you see mapped out in blue, that remains one of the few visible traces of that tank and that history, right? And looking through archival photos, you can see that when the tank had water for most of the year, it was also home to the Madras Boat Club's activities. There used to be a regatta and so on. So very much a part of the city's cultural spirit and presence. Today, this canal is largely disconnected from public life, difficult to access, heavily polluted, and so on. Common story in a lot of Indian cities, tragically. Despite a lot of repeated restoration efforts, they have not been successful, and many of them have focused on restoring hydrological function without rebuilding people's everyday relationship with water. And so for me, the question shifted from how can we repair this canal to how do you reconnect a city and its residents with its water? And the canal became a starting point for a broader urban imagination. This timeline traces how the long tank gradually disappeared through successive phases of urban development on the right. But what's important to note is memory of water remained, even when the water itself disappeared. And what is eventually built on these filled in water bodies contains traces of what once was. For instance, if you overlay the former lake boundary with current land use, you reveal a trend where much of the reclaimed lake bed was subsequently occupied by schools and colleges, basically institutional land use, right, which are learning spaces. At the same time, it's important to note that Chennai's relationship with water is not only physical, right? It's deeply cultural. So, for instance, we have this thing called the Margali Masam, which is an auspicious month in Tamil calendar, and it hosts the city's famous music and dance season. It takes place during the monsoon. It's become an important part of the city's identity. So this overlap between seasonal cycles, learning spaces, and cultural events became an insight for me to frame the project. And so this project attempts to read climatic, cultural, and social systems together and how we can reconnect people to these water systems that sustain the city. The proposal again here works across three scales, where the watershed scale, the canal scale, and then a series of site-specific interventions. This allows local actions to connect back to the larger hydrological systems. At the city scale, this project begins by understanding Chennai's watershed systems. Water does not follow administrative boundaries, and so design for anything related to water must respond to watershed boundaries and not ward boundaries, and hydrological sort of basins and so on. So this site sits between the Kuam and the Adyar rivers, making it part of a larger water network rather than an isolated location and so on. The framing of this project comes from the word Purambok. Historically, this Tamil word referred to shared commons such as water bodies and grazing lands. Today, it's often used as a derogatory term, meaning something is worthless. This project attempts to reclaim its original meaning. This reclamation is already visible in cultural movements like the song I just played for you, the Chennai Purambok Padal, extremely powerful, and repositions commons as spaces of collective value. Purambok is in your care, it is in mine. The project builds on that spirit of music. And so, at the large scale, this project envisions three relationships that people have with water. The first is to connect, making water visible and accessible in the city. The second is to learn, understanding water as a living system and learning around it and about it. Celebrate, that is, celebrating the seasonal rhythms of water as opposed to treating it as something that has to leave the city as soon as possible. Together, these interventions create a new relationship between water and the people that live nearby. How can we connect people to water, learn about it, and celebrate it? So, of course, there's a proposed retention system which is designed to hold volumes of water comparable to a 25-year storm within the study area because it was a climate and flood resilience project. And so this proposal reimagines the canal as a visible and accessible landscape. Rather than pushing water away, the project creates space to store, slow, and absorb it while creating public and educational landscapes. At the neighborhood scale, the Mambalam Canal becomes the organizing spine for intervention. It offers opportunities for ecological and public space improvements. The design particularly gives water more space to spread, to slow down, infiltrate the ground, and be stored. So raised pathways, bridges, floodable landscapes, and retention areas create a public realm that works with water rather than against it. This proposal transforms the existing schools that we saw the trend into living laboratories and classrooms for water. Playgrounds become rain gardens and spaces that are recessed down for water to be held. The project also proposes festival grounds and public spaces that reconnect cultural life with seasonal water cycles. So, example, the festival that already occurs in that month, how can we sync it to a cultural space that then holds water during the monsoon as well? Public spaces become places where hydrology is visible and understandable. Through these two sections, as you can see, everything that is yellow is now then a public space. And then water becomes something that is visible. So water infrastructure then also helps become educational infrastructure, where you will see the connection and you will see the seasonality of it, something that we don't see in the city today much. Together, these three ideas of connecting, learning, and celebrating form a framework for what I call Purambok urbanism. Purambok urbanism reframes infrastructure as socio-ecological and culturally legible. While, of course, this is a speculative design imagining, it is crucial that this vision is not confined to the academic realm. For these ideas to take root, fragmented water governance must bring together multiple agencies, citizens, and institutions, and so on. In doing so, I hope a Porambok way of thinking about water can begin to take shape, one that works at the scale of the watershed while nurturing neighborhood level stewardship through local water champions.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Through your presentation, it was so clear about how important research, simulation, and environmental analysis is, and how it leads to informed design decisions. So well presented. Thank you so much, ma'am. And when it comes to glass performance specifically, so what kind of insights from daylight studies, thermal simulation, or spatial analysis tend to most strongly influence your design choices when it comes to your projects?
Yeah, I'm usually interested in the balance between daylight, comfort, and energy performance. So, daylight studies help us understand where natural light can improve occupant experience, and thermal analysis helps identify potential overheating risks, especially in a climate like India. So the value of these tools is that they move design decisions beyond assumptions. For example, of course, we have the standards of like North Light and so on, but how can we make more evidence-based choices for the use of glass that respond to local climatic conditions? And I see increasingly with heat becoming such a major issue in India, how can we use glass in buildings to create thermal comfort inside them and make sure that we're using it in the right part of the building, in the right direction, at the right angle, and that we have evidence for those choices.
Evidence-based design decisions are very important for our practical putting up. So when we speak about high mobility public environments like transit hubs, stations, and movement corridors, glass often plays a role in shaping visibility, orientation, and spatial clarity, like you said. So how do you see it in contributing to navigation, comfort, and intuitive movement in such fast-paced infrastructures?
Yeah, I think movement through public environments, especially transit stops and so on, depend heavily on how visible they are and also on how intuitive they are. If you've been to a good airport, then you'll know that you don't have to look at anything because everything is just clearly laid out for you and it's very intuitive to your body to understand where to go and how to go and navigate the space. I think in terms of visibility, transparent and translucent materials like glass can really help people understand where they are, where they need to go, and how these different spaces can connect and how we can get through. So I think when glass is combined with good environmental design as well, it can make large public infrastructure spaces or like movement corridors feel more intuitive when your orientation is sorted, and then also more welcoming and safe, right? Of how much time you want to spend in them and so on, and how you want to navigate and move around.
And I agree. And even access to well-lit, comfortable, and visually open public environments is increasingly seen as an important part of urban quality of life. So you've touched on this before, but maybe you could elaborate more. And but in that sense, how do you see glass contributing to making public infrastructure more inclusive and equitable across different user groups, especially in climate vulnerable or resource constrained urban contexts?
Yeah, inclusivity I'm seeing increasingly in design spaces is often framed in terms of physical access, but I think it's equally about access to quality environments, right? For example, glass is sometimes can be seen as something that is available only to a privileged few or high performing class. But I want to break that notion where public infrastructure should offer comfort, dignity, safety, and connection to all users. And materials such as glass can contribute because they help create spaces that are visually connected, welcoming, and easy to navigate, where they create transparency and so on. And they also, again, help with thermal performance, which I think is something that we're seeing now in large infrastructure spaces. I also think that materials like glass, because of their transparency and their material quality, can create surprises in public spaces, which is beautiful. I remember walking down a lane once, it's a historic precinct in Turkey, and where the floor suddenly transformed from cobblestone to glass. And the reason they had done that was underneath the glass you could see the ruins of the previous generation. That's something that creates delight in a public space, right? And surprise and delight, and that's only possible with a material like glass because of what it offers. And now they're becoming so durable you can walk on them, and all forms of glass that we can use in public spaces. So I think it's of course the quality of the material, but also how can we go one step beyond and make it surprise, delight, joyful in public spaces. So I see glass being a key sort of contributor there. And it's also how design decisions like this can support environmental justice, and it ensures that high quality public environments are available to everyone, not just a privileged few. And we go beyond the sort of inclusivity of ramps and so on and move to really inclusivity of quality spaces and public spaces that are full of joy.
That's great, ma'am. Very true. Such a wonderful experience also you shared. So a small bonus question for all the students watching. You are such a renowned researcher. So for students who are interested in research, what what advice would you give them, and what maybe are the skills that they would need to inculcate when they are entering the field of research in architecture?
Yeah, I think the first thing is students, designers, researchers, we all need to become much more interdisciplinary in our curiosity. So when we're seeking sort of influences for a project, or when we're seeking inspiration, it should come from music, it should come from literature, it should come from, so for example, even for the project that I presented, it came from a song. A song gave me the framing of the project and what I even called for a book. And of course the word has a long history of like not being, the land not being taxed and hence being worthless and so on, but the inspiration came from music, which is not what you would traditionally associate in urban design. So we need to be much more interdisciplinary in our curiosity when we're doing research. And I also think the future designer is not simply a technical expert, especially with the rise of AI and so on. The future designer is someone who can synthesize knowledge across different fields and translate that into a meaningful public space or public environment. And so I think we need to shift from researching or designing objects to understanding and designing relationships. Even when we talk about urban design, I had a professor who used to say, don't think of it as if you're designing a site, you're tweaking a set of relationships for a particular project to happen in the future. So I think in that sense, young designers need to become much more place-based in their thinking. We need to be more rooted. With climate change, we need to be more curious about ecological systems and more comfortable working with complexity and ambiguity. We should spend less time looking for universal solutions that will fit every context and more time understanding the specific landscapes, like I spoke about landscape literacy earlier, communities and histories that we are working within. And again, with climate change and so much social inequality that we see, global geopolitics, it really requires designers to work across disciplines and also to engage with communities more deeply. Community engagement is no longer a tick box, it has to be something we do from the very beginning. And so the challenge is not simply how do we make this building more efficient or how do we make this building or public space perform better, but how do we create new imaginations for how people, ecosystems, and infrastructure can coexist. And to me, that requires systems thinking, thinking at a systems level about a project, about a city, interdisciplinary collaboration. Some of the most interesting projects I've done with are from people who are not architects or urban designers in any capacity. And I also think a willingness to ask better questions before rushing to solutions. I think this sort of widening of curiosity and being okay with complexity and ambiguity and engaging across disciplines and with communities is what I would say we should look for today, and to younger students as well.
That is a wonderful takeaway for all the students who've joined us. We're almost coming to the end of the webinar. And as we look toward India 2047, what shifts in mindset or approach do you believe are essential for young designers and planners to create public infrastructures that are resilient, humane, and like you said, deeply connected to the community and the people?
I think I would just tie up everything that I've said before, where I think one mindset and approach shift has to be that any public infrastructure is not restricted to a site. We have to look at the systems that sustain that site, and we have to look at it much beyond the boundaries of your sort of site that you have. So, for example, in the project that I showed, the site is technically just the canal, right? But a lot of research went into understanding that canal and understanding the many layers on that canal. And that includes like history, that includes current affairs, that includes looking at it from a government perspective, looking at it from an economical perspective, looking at it from a social justice perspective. So I think one is change this mindset of a site and tabula rasa, and we're going to create some magic around it. Like urban design is deeply linked to everything in the city, to all systems, and we need to think of it like that. And in a sense, to me, a designer working in the public realm is a brilliant synthesizer of knowledge, and that is our strength, and that's what we should learn to cultivate, to build, of how we can learn to read different things very quickly and incorporate that into public spaces.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And with that insightful conversation, we come to the end of today's webinar. Thank you so much, Architect Nupur, for sharing your perspectives and experiences so thoughtfully with us today. What stands out from this discussion is how public infrastructure today is no longer defined by just function or scale, but the quality of experience that it offers, how it supports the well being, learning, and interaction in everyday life within cities. From understanding systems level thinking in urban design to exploring how materials like glass can shape the light, the comfort, perception, and connection, this conversation has helped us see how deeply intertwined the infrastructure and human experience truly are. Your insights have highlighted how thoughtful design decisions across the climate, material, and systems can collectively contribute to creating public environments that are more inclusive, resilient, and responsive to people's needs. On behalf of Glass Academy and Ethos Empowers, thank you once again, Architect Nupur, for your time and for your valuable contributions and an amazing presentation. And to our audience, thank you for joining us today. We hope this session encourages you to think more deeply about how architecture, urban systems, and materials like glass can together shape healthier and more meaningful public environments. Stay tuned for our upcoming webinars as we continue exploring conversations at the intersection of architecture, materials, climate, and human experience. See you all in the next session. Thank you.